Hi everyone, my name is Shailvi Wakhlu. I go by the she, her pronouns, and today we'll be diving into the intentional plan for intersectionality to make sure no underrepresented person in tech is ever left behind. A few quick notes about me. I grew up in India and wanted to work with computers since a very young age. My personal mission is to make sure to support, mentor, and be a useful resource for underrepresented groups in their STEM careers. I work at Strava as a senior director of data. Strava is the world's leading social platform for athletes, and we serve 86 million athletes across 195 countries. If you'd like to join a thoughtful company that supports the global athlete community, we are hiring. I've spent more than 7 years in management roles, and I've spent my entire career building products for wide audiences. Intersectionality is a topic that I began researching a few years ago, starting with my own experience. Over time, I collected some nuggets that helped me make more sense of it and put together my own plan for action. I hope all of you who chose to drop in for this talk today know how deep your impact can be on positive outcomes for marginalized groups in tech. Some of these outcomes are internal for the people who work in tech, and some of these outcomes are external through the products we launch. Hopefully, by the end of the talk, you have good ideas for how you can plan to support intersectional experiences. Today, we'll first take a look at understanding intersectionality, learn about the ways in which it shows up, and some examples of issues it can cause. And finally, how we can start to address some of those issues. First up, what is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 80s. She gave a very popular TED Talk that was published in 2016, where she said that many of our social justice problems, like racism and sexism, are often overlapping, and they create multiple levels of social injustice. These injustices cannot be solved by addressing only one of the causes. For example, the marginalization of women was understood and documented. The marginalization of Black people was also documented. But there are unique problems that Black women face, which has not historically been understood or documented. Understanding, acknowledging, and addressing these problems, which are greater than the sum of its parts, is what a lot of her efforts have focused on. Her talk sparked a lot more research on the topic and also led to the creation of many more data points than were previously available. This helped improve understanding of those compounding effects that she talked about. For all of you visual learners, here's another way to think about the concept. Let's think of various shapes, each of which may represent the problems that are faced by a single identity. In this example, I have 3 shapes representing gender, race, and age. There can be many more shapes representing many more identities. Now let's overlap some of these shapes. These overlappings now represent the problems faced by that intersecting identity. For example, the problems that you face as a woman who is older, or a woman of color, or an older woman of color. Here again, there are many more combinations, but I have only used the base combinations that intersect with the gender from the existing identities or shapes that we were looking at. Let's add the next level of complexity, which represents the space where anybody might face issues. That is being depicted by a specific color. People face issues in the workplace, or in the healthcare system, or in the legal system. Again, there can be many more colors representing many more spaces. And finally, putting it all together, we have overlapping shapes where the overlap has a particular color. This represents the problems faced by an intersectional identity in a particular space. This helps us think about what problems older women might face in the workplace, or what problems women of color might face in healthcare, and the problem older women of color might face in the legal system. Here too, there are many more combinations than what I have listed here. The colors for each of the overlaps can change as you explore a different space. With that, I'll anchor that today I'm going to focus on the base demographic of women within the various intersections. So if you go back to the shape analogy, in the overlaps, at least one of the shapes will be gender. I'm anchoring this conversation to women, which includes trans women, not to in any way diminish the experience of other intersectionalities, but rather to speak from my own experience for a demographic that I've been able to research more effectively. Overall, I hope the learnings to be applicable across other intersectionalities. For me, it helps me pursue my goal of leaving no woman behind, which is where I feel I can have the most impact. I hope in general, this can spark ideas about ways to be inclusive. Another way to understand intersectionality, I'd love to share the story of Sojourner Truth. She was a famed American abolitionist and women's rights activist. She had a lot of impact on both movements during the mid 1800s. If you've heard a lot more about Frederick Douglass, who was also an abolitionist, and Susan B. Anthony, who was a women's rights activist, that is not a coincidence. Truth and Douglass worked together on anti slavery efforts, while Truth and Anthony collaborated for women's rights. But in both those cases, even though she was dedicating herself towards the justice for the marginalized, however, neither movements fully elevated her contributions or gave her equity in the outcome. She was contributing to the success of both movements, but the groups didn't really optimize for her experience and bluntly declared that she was second priority. In the abolitionist movement, she was the inferior female voice, and in the suffragette movement, she was the racial minority. This is one of the many examples that explains why even today we still see such poor outcomes for women of color, especially Black women in our society. Inherently, we keep deprioritizing the needs of the marginalized within the marginalized. Both movements she participated in were fighting for justice. However, neither bothered to explicitly include fighting for justice for Black women. It was just like she said, the rich rob the poor and the poor rob one another. That faulty mindset that there aren't somehow enough resources to go around so that all marginalized identities can seek justice is still something that unfortunately continues to today. As we saw in the case of Miss Truth, even marginalized identities can marginalize other identities. This brings us to the concept of exploring our own privilege. We're used to thinking of ourselves in this very binary way. Either we have privilege or we don't have privilege. But the reality is, there are some areas where we benefit from social dominance, and there are other areas where we experience marginalization. Using whatever privilege we have for the benefit of others who don't have that privilege is how we keep the world moving towards more equity. This list of dimensions along which you may or may not have privilege is non-exhaustive. Take a moment to look at these identities. Think about yourself and the people in your life. How many people do you interact with that belong to a different identity? Do you understand their challenges? And if you don't, how can you educate yourself? And lastly, where can you acknowledge that you have privilege? And what can you do with that privilege? Note that some identities are always going to be more visible than others. We're more likely to notice someone's gender, their race, and age than know about what their religious, education, or economic status is. Based on what we identify quickly, our biases can be very different. Some identities are just more prone to bias than other identities, unfortunately, and some identities are immutable while others can change over time. All of this is hopefully a prompt to think more about these things. I examined my own privilege and highlighted the ones where I think I get a benefit from that identity. People may question my credentials or be more suspicious of me based on my non-dominant race, gender, or nationality. But the fact that I'm a healthy, college-educated, 30-something person living in San Francisco means I have more opportunities than many other people. My location, for example, has directly had a positive effect on my economic status. This awareness of understanding where I have privilege has been helpful for me to put things in perspective, and it has also helped me decide where to focus my efforts when I want to show up as an ally. Let's now examine a few ways problems show up that are caused by intersectionality. I'm choosing to highlight issues as they show up in the space of the workplace. Workplace is, of course, a place where all outcomes can have a very vast influence on the rest of your life. It can directly affect your economic status, healthcare, legal rights, etc. I'm choosing a few intersections and I'm by no means ranking them in any way or creating an exhaustive list. I'm speaking about the topics that I had some degree of connection to or the ones I was able to better research. Pay gap is something that often comes up when we talk about equity in the workplace. It's well known that women currently only earn 82 cents to every $1 a man earns. That stat is pretty sad on its own, but it hides that the data is much worse when you break it down by race. By race, you see that it's easy to see that, like, if you're not white or an Asian woman like I am, your salary outcomes are actually much worse than even the 82 cents that people keep talking about. By hiding the nuances of the data, it is easy to see how so many people miss the demographic for which the burden is the largest. In the workplace, gender identity can also lead to much more discrimination if you are trans woman or non-binary. Oftentimes, the healthcare options available through our employers provide inadequate coverage to women that don't meet their needs for maternity, for example. For trans women, it can be even worse, as their medically required treatments or mental health options may not be covered. Trans women have a 44% chance of being diagnosed with clinical depression. So the lack of good healthcare access can be dire for them. Besides that, many other problems that women face in the workplace, like harassment, which can be sexual or verbal in nature, are worse for trans women and non-binary who shouldn't have to put up with a hostile work environment. Microaggressions in the form of misgendering, belittling, and decreased access to opportunities are also other problems. For women in the workplace who are immigrants, there are also many additional problems that they might face. They could face an increased risk of deportation, and then they face difficulties navigating the legal system that doesn't grant them consistent protections. 13% of the women living in US are immigrants. Their participation in the labor force, how much they earn, what kind of job they have, all of that can be affected by their immigration status. They may be fearful and face isolation due to their status. This can lead to much higher tolerance for abuse that employers may exploit. This is especially pronounced for undocumented immigrants, though documented immigrants also routinely face explicit or implicit threats from employers, partners, landlords, etc. Overall, immigrant women have less opportunities to find meaningful work and fair counsel in a system that already fails women by being too slow and inadequate in its capacity to address injustices. Religion is another one of those attributes that should have absolutely no bearing on women's success at work, but unfortunately it ends up playing a role. Employers or sometimes entire industries can have something which is just very hesitant to make workplace accommodations. And that means that women of certain religion may have even less opportunities available to them. Some of them, maybe they need flexibility with the time or days of the week or even the seasons. Others maybe need more privacy or prefer to wear clothes that are not part of an official uniform. And some might need help navigating nuances that are more cultural than purely religious in nature. There is also the issue of belonging and how much othering people feel at their job. If all bonding events are geared around something like a barbecue or a happy hour that women of certain religions may not feel comfortable participating in, then that's one other reason for them to feel isolated and eventually result in lower job performance. The last intersection in the workplace that I'll cover is educational background. It is commonplace for jobs to have an over-indexing on traditional skills that aren't even a good predictor of job performance. Some jobs say they require advanced degrees or list a bunch of skills which are not actually required. The same job will still attract some applications from men who may not have the skills, but women tend to often self-select outside and not apply to jobs where they feel they don't meet all the requirements. This happens even more for women with non-traditional educational backgrounds, as they already may feel the imposter syndrome for a space that doesn't seem like it belongs to them. If they do apply and actually get the job, Their positioning at work might still remain very biased, with people assuming that their boot camp was in some way inferior to a traditional education. Such biases are not true, and they're very harmful to the women who didn't have access to educational opportunities, but still somehow found the way to persevere and catch up on relevant skills for the job that they're interested in. For all of these examples, things like this can show up in the workplace even before someone is hired. Think of a woman who's applying for a job. It's well documented that prospective employers will typically make a lot of explicit and implicit assumptions about her skills, her experiences, her competencies, all of that due to bias. All of this will affect her chances of getting the job. If she also happens to be a woman of color, her personal appearance might be judged. Employers may make snap judgments about her perceived professionalism based on her deviation from the norm and the known that they're more used to. And if she also happens to be someone with a disability, the chances of how accommodating her employer is likely to be will go down dramatically, especially if the employers feel that they're already well outside their comfort zone. These were some of the many examples of how different intersectionalities show up in different settings. Some of these may be familiar to you because you or someone you know faces them. And think about your own role in conversations around privilege. Where do you fit in specific identities? Maybe you are the marginalized, where you're actually affected by the bias. Your priority in this case is to solve it for yourself and try to solve it for others. You can see it, you can document it, and you can try to get people to understand and try to change the status quo. You might be an ally, in which case you yourself are in a position of privilege in a given situation, and you can do the work to fix it for others. You'll be penalized less, and in fact, probably praised if you are selflessly solving it for someone else. And finally, there is a chance that you are, in fact, the perpetrator. In some way, you are amplifying problems faced by those not in power. You are either doing this through direct harm or indirectly when you choose to not decenter yourself in a problem. You have to have the self-awareness to admit that even if you are marginalized on one identity, you can still make things worse for other identities. And so in any given situation, think, if you are not the victim, then who do you want to be today? In order to prioritize the needs of the marginalized, we have to come up and put in a plan of action that is inclusive and that is intentional. We can no longer claim ignorance. We can no longer ask subgroups of people to wait their turn while we focus on the biggest groups of the marginalized section. To address this, I turn to the philosophy of a man I really admire. This is Mahatma Gandhi, the world's first practitioner of the principle of nonviolence on a large-scale political field. He dedicated his life to advocating for the marginalized, promoting harmony and pursuing truth. In one of the last notes he left behind before his assassination, he wrote, "Whenever you are in doubt, recall the face of the poorest person and ask yourself if the step you contemplate will be of any use to them." This is a wonderful way to think about our own actions and practice the philosophy of prioritizing the needs of the most disadvantaged first. When we are faced with a lot of choices, especially in cases where we have some privilege, when deciding how to respond to those choices, why not pause and think about how our choices would not just impact our future, but the future of those who are most vulnerable, those that don't have a seat on the table and are hoping you'll use your seat to advocate for them. Based on that philosophy, I propose a 3-step plan to solve for intersectionality. The 3 steps are awareness, acknowledgement, and action. Awareness is the first step to solving any challenge. If we don't see it and we don't understand it, we can't fix it. By default, it's hard to be aware of all the problems that exist, especially the problems that don't affect us directly. So how can we proactively build our awareness? We can consciously build our empathy. We can learn from people with different identities and try to understand their perspective and build empathy. When we are surrounded by people from similar backgrounds, we don't get the chance to hear a different perspective. So instead, seek out people who are different from you. And if they're open to sharing their experience, ask them to share it. Go to conferences and meetups that focus on challenges for specific identities if those spaces welcome allies to learn and engage. Honestly, even reading the agenda of what's discussed at an event for a different demographic can help you start building curiosity. And be genuine with your curiosity without being intrusive. Next, we can intentionally find and fix the flaws. A lot of engineers in the room, I'm sure, and engineers are used to this. It is common practice for us to break our own code. If you're making a decision, look for loopholes. Play devil's advocate and see how your decision can unravel, and think of all the things that can go wrong. Sometimes the things that can go wrong are all the more likely to be a problem that only certain demographics encounter. In which case, it isn't so much that something is going wrong, but rather your solution just doesn't account for all these use cases. Knowing that upfront can help you decide what, if anything, you'd like to do about it. Another way to build awareness is to intentionally look for the data. A lot of common issues that occur are documented, and there's usually data available online to back up and quantify individual problems. Even if there's no information available for a specific identity you're curious about, it helps to start thinking and proactively look for some of that information. Even related topics and data can be useful in thinking about the problem and identifying common places where the system fails. Quantitative data can help show you the problem in aggregate, but qualitative data can help find those niche concerns that people are bringing up. The next step in the plan for intersectionality is acknowledgement. One part of that is to just acknowledge and state the status quo. When you see something, say something. As you observe and become aware of how discrimination may be showing up, find ways to explicitly highlight those observations. You as an ally have the capacity to not face the consequences that usually come with highlighting an injustice. And that's just a privilege that you can use for the benefit of others. The other part of acknowledgement is acknowledge and admit your own gaps. We are not ever going to be in a position to know about every nuance. And there are some areas where we've just not spent enough time thinking about it. That is not unusual. Rather than being embarrassed about your lack of exposure, be upfront that you are learning and show genuine but non-intrusive curiosity. People you are trying to learn from will appreciate that vulnerability and be more inclined to spend the time getting you up to speed. If you're worried about offending someone, just state that you are trying to learn more, don't have enough knowledge, and just ask. People rarely get mad at folks who show a genuine willingness to learn and grow. The final step is to consolidate all your learnings and go into problem-solving mode. What can you do today as an ally to help marginalized identities and show up for other people? As you think about solutions, find ways to hold yourself accountable by creating SMART goals. Focus on measurable outcomes rather than just general nudging towards equity. Your commitment and perseverance towards building equity will be important to the marginalized groups for whom you are an ally. It is also a good idea to include other people in your journey to create equity for all groups. Share your learnings, ask people to chime in with their thoughts, and brainstorm solutions. There is a lot of talent to be utilized within your network to come up with creative solutions. And it's always a good idea to learn and do as a community while seeking diverse perspectives. To wrap it all up, if we want everyone to have equity, we can't wait. If the community we build isn't inclusive, even if we are marginalized, we're still no better than those who have marginalized us. We need to keep advocating for justice and fairness and pushing for everyone to have an equal chance at success. Thank you all for prioritizing planning for intersectionality and making sure nobody is left behind. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Even after today, if you want to reach out and share your observations, I'd absolutely welcome that. Some few references that I used for part of this research If you need the links, find me on Twitter. I'm happy to share it. There's a lot of interesting reading in there. And with that, thank you again for listening. I hope this talk resonated and that you had some useful takeaways. Again, any comments, questions that you might have, any personal stories that you're open to sharing, I am very, very willing to engage with that. I'm also available on Twitter, and my website contains the videos of all my talks. Thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.